However, both of them were undead, and climbing a flight of stairs was not enough to tire them out. The room was very spacious, and the first thing they noticed was that the ceiling was very high. Then, they noticed the two enormous size beyond king-size beds that were planted smack in the middle of the room, and then they noticed the exceptionally large cabinet and benches. Kino exclaimed in delight and threw herself onto the bed, and then the look on her face defied description. She had probably expected to be bounced back up after jumping onto the bed, but there were no springs inside, and what she felt instead was a stiff sensation. That said, the clean white sheets alone more than merited a passing grade. "So, when will we be going to the market, Satoru?" It had become a tradition for the two of them to visit the markets whenever they came to a new city. Not only did it fulfill the requirement of buying items necessary for their travels, it also allowed them to investigate the market. "Well, about that, it's fun to go strolling down the city streets, and we need to find a market and get a feel for the situation, while the grains haven't rotted. Still, I was hoping to learn more about the surrounding countries. After all, your knowledge is out of date, Kino." Upon hearing that, Kino narrowed her eyes slightly. "Me and my big mouth," Suzuki Satoru lamented as he saw her reaction. However, apologizing now would probably only make it worse, so it was probably better to pretend he had not noticed. In that case, wouldn't a bard be better than a trader? That's true. A bard would be more appropriate. It would seem she was not particularly mad. After hearing Kino's prompt answer, a weight lifted off Suzuki Satoru's heart. A traveling merchant or a bard or some other related tradesman would probably know the surroundings best. A mercenary might pay attention to the situation in the nearby country, but a trader would have heard rumors of what happened in more distant lands, while bards might have come from even further. Between the two of them, traders were better for accurate information, but in terms of general topics, bards came out on top. Since biased information could result in huge losses, traders typically spent a lot of effort to ensure their news was reliable. In turn, bards sought stories from further afield, but they were not too concerned with accuracy. Being interesting was good enough. However, there were cases where some stories which seemed fake interesting tidbits from distant lands had actually happened. In short, since Suzuki Satoru and Kino wanted to know more things, it was obvious that they would pick a bard. Even if the news they gained was fake or just rumors, it would simply be a matter of sighing in regret and going, "Ah, what a shame, it looks like I came all this way for nothing. Where shall I go next?" That was because they were undead being possessed of infinite lifespans, they could afford to be that cavalier. One could also say that they could savor the joy of the situation because they were undead. The joy of fruitless effort. In addition, there was another reason for choosing a bard. Bards considered storytelling to be a job. They would eagerly do so if paid. On the other hand, traders were the sort of people whose information concerned their interests. Sometimes, it would be hard to get anything out of them, and they might not share what they knew honestly with Suzuki Satoru and Kino, being that they were strangers. If they tried for an introduction through a trader's guild, one problem was that there were as many guilds as there were trade goods, and another was that members of the guild were typically curt to outsiders, citing reasons such as secrecy agreements and guild rules and the like. It typically ended up being very troublesome. While bards had their guilds too, their management was not nearly as strict as those of traders' guilds. Of course, some of them had strict rules, but experienced wanderers from faraway lands, in other words, higher-level bards, typically had an easier time in the guilds. However, Suzuki Satoru and Kino were not concerned with such details. "We'll hire a bard, then. Besides, we got a whole bunch of treasure from that previous lot, enough for several lifetimes of spending, so we'll just be more generous with the payouts." Suzuki Satoru smirked to himself, and it seemed Kino had not seen it. However, she wrinkled her brow and smiled bitterly for some other reason. Suzuki Satoru sensed that there was some other meaning behind her expression, and decided to let her give him his score for that undead joke just now. About 30-odd points. "Really? Are you sure you weren't lowballing it? I thought it was appropriate. It wasn't particularly funny or memorable." While he had not expected it to be a gutbuster of a joke, it was still disappointing to get such a low score. If this were a performance assessment or some kind of department goal, Suzuki Satoru would have probably started bargaining with his boss. "Alright, let's go change our mood and find a bard. We'll go ask the innkeeper about it first." After paying the introduction fee to the innkeeper, the man brought over the bard that he had recommended in short order. Said bard was dressed in clothing that was just as fancy as the Sin, and he was a member of the Four Eyes humanoid race, that hailed from a land somewhat distant from this one. A brief conversation with him revealed that he was quite a well-traveled bard, in other words, a fairly high-level one. That said, his level was nowhere near Suzuki Satoru's. Of course, he had only encountered one being of comparable power to himself during his travels. That would be the entity who resided upon the peak that men called the highest on the continent, a mighty foe who commanded the great power known as Wild Magic, the Brightness Dragon Lord, whose confrontation with Suzuki Satoru had ended in a draw. Suzuki Satoru and Kino listened to the bard's tales. Well, they had no idea why it was so. Foreign spoken languages in this world were automatically translated into a recognizable form. Specific nouns retained their original pronunciation, but other meaningful vocabulary was translated. The question of who had done this and how they had done it was a riddle that remained unsolved. The logic behind the translation of song lyrics was murkier. An unskilled singer's words would sound like meaningless, broken nonsense. The performer's skill was not the only criteria either. The audience also needed a certain degree of culture and understanding. According to Kino, being able to accurately understand a song was a mark of social status in the upper crust, and there were actually specialized classes for such things. In any case, a Philistine like Suzuki Satoru, who not only had no taste but was uncultured to boot, would only be able to think, what the hell is this guy singing? No matter how skilled the singer was. Of course, he would be able to understand the words if they were not automatically translated, which is to say, if someone sang them in Japanese. However, in all his years of running around outdoors, he had never heard anyone speaking Japanese. However, concluding that nobody here had ever used the languages of Suzuki Satoru's world would be jumping to conclusions. Fragments of them had been passed down through history, and Suzuki Satoru had also personally seen items that proved they existed. Being that Suzuki Satoru's mind was focused on such matters, the bard's song went in one ear ran out the other, but it was a different matter for Kino, who had received a royal education. She was lost in the beautiful music, and so Suzuki Satoru also pretended that he was listening to the song. While he had no idea what the bard was singing, he clapped along with Kino at the end of each song. Though he found it incredibly boring, it was basic etiquette for a salaryman to keep it from showing on his face. After several songs, it was finally time for the conversation segment that Suzuki Satoru had been looking forward to for so long. Suzuki Satoru wasted no time and began asking him about rumors from the surrounding countries and what he had seen on the way here. After about 3 hours, Suzuki Satoru felt that he had learned enough from the bard, and so he briefly left his place. When he returned, he placed a leather pouch on the table. Good heavens! Is all this money for me? The bard made no attempt to hide his surprise as he took the gold coins out of the pouch. Did you get the amount wrong? In response to the bard's question, Suzuki Satoru's attitude shifted to one of forthright generosity. Personally, I think it's not enough for that wonderful voice of yours. Kino nodded and made noises of approval. If Suzuki Satoru had only paid him a paltry sum, she would probably have taken out her own purse to reward him. Suzuki Satoru had long since discerned her desire to reward him. The contents of Suzuki Satoru's own wallet went without saying, but Kino was also loaded. They had split the funds from the various members of Corpus of the Abyss evenly between them. Kino had originally refused, but since they were traveling together, it meant that they were equal partners. Still, Suzuki Satoru was in charge of the stolen cash for the most part, while he had given the gemstones and the like to Kino. There was a certain reason for this arrangement, and Kino did not seem unhappy with it. You're too kind. I didn't think my performance would be that well received. Thank you. The bard was grinning so widely that he could not shut his mouth. While the amount he had paid the bard just now was more than the usual rate given the circumstances, it probably would not arouse suspicion if he said it was because he appreciated the skills of this bard. In exchange for Suzuki Satoru's appreciation, the other party had developed great goodwill for him. This was an example of how an appropriate gift of money could endear one to others, a lesson that they had learned during their journey. Naturally, 10 gold coins was pocket change to Suzuki Satoru. If he were of a mind to do so, even paying several hundred times that amount would not even begin to raise a wrinkle on his brow. However, that was not how things were done. Overpaying, especially far above market price, tended to draw the attention of wicked and calculative people, and all the trouble they brought in their wake. She thought highly of your singing, while I was impressed by your knowledge. We will be staying here for the next few days. During this time, I hope you will continue gathering information. If it pleases me, I will continue paying you. The bard's eyes lit up as he heard this.